The cleansing of the hybrids, the mystery of the Anakim in the biblical narrative. There are battles that appear to be simple military confrontations, yet, when you read them more attentively, you discover that they seem to hide a very different war, a war against clans that, according to the text itself, were not like the others. Today we are going to delve into one of those stories, an episode that many read as nothing more than a military victory by Joshua, but that, when we look at it closely, seems to describe a selective operation to eliminate a very particular lineage, a lineage that the Bible presents as the descendants of hybrid beings. I mean the Anakim, a tall, strong, and feared people whom some biblical and extra-biblical texts connect with the mysterious Nephilim of Genesis 6. The story begins in Joshua 11 when the people of Israel, under Joshua's leadership, are consolidating the conquest of Canaan. In verses 21 and 22 we read, "At that time Joshua came and destroyed the Anakim from the hill country, from Hebron, from Debir, from Anab, from all the hill country of Judah, and from all the hill country of Israel. Joshua destroyed them with their cities. None of the Anakim remained in the land of the children of Israel. They only remained in Gaza, in Gath, and in Ashdod." Stop for a moment and think about this. The text says that none remained in the land of Israel, yet they did remain in Gaza, Gath, and Ashdod. Coincidence, or an intentional omission? Because those three cities were not just any places. Gaza, Gath, and Ashdod were part of Philistine territory. And if we continue reading the biblical story, we discover that from Gath, centuries later, Goliath would arise. And not only he, but several other giants mentioned in 2 Samuel 21. This raises a disturbing question. If the command was to eliminate the Anakim, why did survivors remain precisely in strategic places? And why in those places would their descendants remain active for generations? To understand who the Anakim were, we must go back to Numbers 13:33, where the spies sent by Moses describe what they saw in Canaan. There we saw giants, the sons of Anak, from the race of the giants. And we seemed to ourselves like grasshoppers, and so we seemed to them. Here the Hebrew text uses two key words, Anakim and Nephilim. The link is direct. The sons of Anak are part of the same race as the Nephilim mentioned in Genesis 6:1-4, which speaks of the sons of God who took human wives and fathered giants or men of renown. If we accept that connection, then the Anakim were not simply a tall people, but descendants of a hybrid lineage, born of the union between celestial beings and humans. This is where the hypothesis comes into play. Joshua's campaign against the Anakim was not an ordinary war. It was a cleansing aimed at a lineage that, according to tradition, should not exist. A lineage that represented, for the Israelites, both a spiritual and physical threat. But then, why leave survivors? Was it disobedience, a political strategy, or perhaps a way of preserving something that, though forbidden, some considered valuable? The book of Deuteronomy 9:1-2 gives us another clue. Moses, speaking to the people, says, "Hear, O Israel, you are today to cross the Jordan, to go in to dispossess nations greater and mightier than you, cities great and fortified to the heavens, a people great and tall, the sons of the Anakim, of whom you know and have heard it said, who can stand before the sons of Anak?" This description goes beyond mere physical stature. Fortified to the heavens is language that evokes pre-led cities and stories of ancient civilizations that possessed unusual technology or power. In Jewish tradition and in texts like 1 Enoch, we find accounts that expand this story. The book of Enoch describes how certain angels, called watchers, descended to earth, took human wives, and fathered giants. These hybrids, according to Enoch, brought corruption and violence and taught humanity forbidden arts. If the Anakim were part of that lineage, their destruction was not only a territorial matter, but a form of genetic and spiritual purge. Yet the Bible itself makes it clear that the task was not completed. And here the theory becomes more provocative. What if some Israelite leaders saw in those hybrids a military advantage? What if the Philistine cities that sheltered them knew exactly who they were, and protected them because they represented a unique resource? Remember, Gath, home of Goliath, was known for its military strength. A warrior like Goliath was not just a symbol, he was a living weapon. Part 2. The Remnants of Gaza, Gath and Ashdod. When we opened the book of Joshua and read that the Anakim survived only in Gaza, Gath and Ashdod, we might not grasp what that means. But the Bible itself reminds us later. In 2 Samuel 21, during the days of King David, we find scenes that seem taken from a saga that began centuries before. Here, the descendants of those Anakim who survived reappear, and they do so in the form of giant warriors. The passage tells us, "There was war again at Gath, then Sibbecai, the Hushathite killed Seth, who was one of the descendants of the giant. Another war broke out against the Philistines, in which Elhanan, son of Uriah from Bethlehem, killed Goliath the Gittite, whose spear shaft was like a weaver's beam. And there was another war at Gath, where there was a man of great stature, who had 6 fingers on each hand and 6 on each foot, 24 in all. He too was a descendant of the giants. Think about this. Generations after Joshua, there were still Anakim descendants in the very cities where they had been left. They did not die out. They did not disappear. They survived and multiplied. This opens 2 lines of interpretation. The first, the simplest, is that Joshua simply could not eliminate them from those Philistine cities, because they were not under Israelite control. But the second is much more intriguing. What if it was not inability, but decision? What if they decided to leave them there, as a military resource or even as part of some unwritten pact? To understand why this matters, we must consider the weight that a man of extraordinary height and strength carried in antiquity. In a time when war was fought hand to hand, a single man like Goliath could change the morale of an entire army. Ancient texts, both biblical and extra-biblical, relate how the fame of a giant could instill terror long before the first sword was raised. And if the Anakim were descended from a hybrid lineage, as Numbers 13:33 and Genesis 6 suggest, then they not only had physical strength, but perhaps other characteristics that made them unique: endurance, superior combat skills, and possibly knowledge inherited from those non-human fathers whom Genesis calls Bena Elohim, sons of God. At this point, it is worth pausing to consider the theology of extermination in the Old Testament. In several passages, God's order is not simply to defeat the enemy but to destroy them completely: men, women, children, and even animals. This has been the subject of theological debate for centuries. Why such an absolute order? One hypothesis some scholars propose is that in certain cases the objective was not merely military, but to eliminate a specific bloodline that represented corruption or danger to the divine plan. This fits with the idea that peoples such as the Anakim were hybrids, bearers of a heritage that had to be eradicated. However, the fact that they survived poses an enigma. If there really was a divine mandate to wipe them out, how do we interpret the survival of entire generations who later faced David? Did Israel's military leaders prioritize political interests over spiritual obedience? In Jewish tradition, some midrashic commentaries suggest that not all cursed peoples were destroyed. Some intermingled with other nations. This creates an interesting dilemma. If a hybrid lineage mixes with others, does its heritage dilute, or remain latent? In modern terms, we could ask, what happens to forbidden DNA if it is dispersed? This is where Gaza, Gath, and Ashdod become a symbol. They are frontier port cities with access to trade routes. Preserving the Anakim in these places not only gave the Philistines formidable warriors, it also allowed them to project power into other regions. Part 3: The Origin of the Hybrid Lineage. Genesis 6. To understand why Joshua confronted the Anakim, and why they were so dangerous, we must go back to one of the most enigmatic and controversial passages in the entire Bible. Genesis 6:2-4. The text says, "When men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born to them, the sons of God, Bena Elohim, saw that the daughters of men were beautiful, and they took wives for themselves, choosing among them all. And they bore children to them. These were the heroes of old, men of renown." In Hebrew, the term Bena Elohim does not refer to ordinary men but to celestial beings. Elsewhere in the Old Testament, this same expression is used to refer to members of the divine council, what in other traditions would be understood as angels or spiritual entities. The union of these sons of God with human women gave rise to the Nephilim, a word that many translations render as giants. But the Hebrew root nephil means to fall or fallen, which has led to interpretations that see them as a fallen, corrupt, and forbidden race. According to 1 Enoch, these giants were not only physically imposing, they also brought corruption to humanity. They taught arts of war, magic, sorcery, and lurking. In other words, they gave men knowledge they were not supposed to have. When the flood comes, the intention seems clear: to wipe out the Nephilim and the corruption they brought. But then an uncomfortable question arises. If the flood wiped them out, how is it that in Numbers 13:33 the spies say that we also saw Nephilim there, and we were like grasshoppers in their sight? This means that, somehow, the hybrid lineage survived the flood. Some apocryphal texts and Jewish commentaries suggest that one or more members of this lineage were preserved, whether by miraculous survival, later corruption, or even because some of the Watchers continued to act after the judgment. Here is where the link with the Anakim comes in. If the spies identify the sons of Anak as part of the same race as the Nephilim, then Joshua was not simply conquering land. He was attacking a lineage that, in the biblical mindset, was not supposed to exist at all. This gives new meaning to the ordered cleansing. It was not a war for resources or territory, but a purge of a genetic and spiritual heritage considered dangerous to the divine plan. And if that is true, leaving survivors was not a trivial omission. It was keeping alive a remnant of what, since Genesis 6, God had wanted to eradicate. Part 4, the Philistines and the preservation of the hybrids. When Joshua destroyed the Anakim in the mountains of Judah and Israel, the text says that they survived only in Gaza, Gath and Ashdod. These were not marginal villages. They were Philistine city-states, part of a powerful confederation that controlled trade routes, ports, and key agricultural zones. The Philistines were not Canaanites in the strict sense. Historical and archaeological studies link them with the Sea Peoples, a group of migrants and warriors who came to the region from the Aegean and other Mediterranean areas. If these newly established peoples found in QAnon clans who were tall, strong, and feared, they probably saw in them a valuable resource, not a threat to be destroyed. This could explain why Gaza, Gath, and Ashdod not only tolerated the Anakim but integrated them. An Anakim on the battlefield was not just a soldier, he was a psychological weapon. His height, strength, and fame generated terror before the battle even began. This is exactly what we see centuries later with Goliath, described in 1 Samuel 17 as a warrior whose mere presence intimidated Israel's army. But here there is something deeper. In the ancient world, preserving a non-human or divine lineage was seen as a way to legitimize power. In Egypt, the pharaohs claimed descent from the gods. In Mesopotamia, Sumerian and Akkadian kings were presented as sons of deities or heirs of demigods. In Greece, the heroic founders of cities often had a divine father or mother. If the Philistines believed the Anakim were descended from celestial beings, their preservation might not have been only for military usefulness, but for prestige and political legitimacy. Having a hybrid leader or champion elevated the city's status in the eyes of allies and enemies. This fits with something unsettling. If the divine order in the Bible was to exterminate these lineages because they were considered a corruption of creation, then the decision to preserve them in Gaza, Gath, and Ashdod was not merely a military act of resistance against Israel. It was direct opposition to the divine plan. It was deliberately protecting what God had declared forbidden. Rabbinic tradition has a concept called zerah corrupt seed. In some commentaries there is talk of peoples whose lineage carried the heritage of the Nephilim, and how that seed was not to mix with Israel. But in other cultures, that same seed was seen as a gift. What for Israel was corruption, for others was power. From a strategic point of view, the presence of these hybrid clans in Gaza, Gath and Ashdod served as a living wall between Israel and the rest of the nations to the west and south. Perhaps for that reason, centuries later, when David became king, he still had to fight wars against Philistines in which giants appeared. The enemy had not changed. It had merely been reconfigured. Part 5. Omission, or Secret Pact. When we read Joshua 11:21-22, the text is clear. Joshua destroyed the Anakim in all the mountains of Judah and in all the mountains of Israel. Joshua destroyed them with their cities. None of the Anakim remained in the land of the children of Israel. Only in Gaza, in Gath, and in Ashdod. On a superficial reading, this seems a simple geographical note. They remained there because those areas were not Israeli territory. But on a closer reading, it is a detail that does not fit the pattern of harem total extermination that appears in other conquest campaigns. When the order was to destroy a people completely, it was carried out. So why not here? This is where the theory of strategic preservation enters. We cannot forget that Israel, in Joshua's time, was surrounded by enemies. A lineage like that of the Anakim with legendary strength and stature could be a double-edged sword, a danger, but also a resource. If there were Israelite leaders who thought long-term, they might have considered that having these clans in Philistine cities served as a living barrier against other threats, or even that in the future they could try to control them or make a pact with them. This idea may seem extreme, but it is not so far-fetched if we look at other biblical episodes. In 1 Kings 9:16, Pharaoh, king of Egypt, conquers Gaza and gives it as a dowry to his daughter when she marries Solomon. This shows that political alliances and marriages between enemy peoples were a real occurrence. In Judges 1, several Israelite tribes do not completely expel the Canaanites from their territories. Instead, they subject them to tribute. Here we see that total obedience to the divine mandate was often sacrificed for economic or military convenience. If Israel was willing to leave ordinary Canaanites alive for its own benefit, why would it not have done the same with a lineage that could offer a unique military advantage? But this convenience came at a cost. The Bible presents the survival of the Anakim as a problem that dragged on for generations. The clashes of David against Goliath and other giants are, in a way, the bill Israel had to pay for not having closed that chapter in Joshua's time. Here we can pose the boldest hypothesis. What if some Israelite leaders, fascinated or intrigued by the stories about the Nephilim, had wanted to investigate, study, or even exploit that lineage? In a world where the kings of other nations boasted of having divine ancestry, is it so absurd to think that some in Israel might have wanted something similar? Rabbinic tradition, in certain midrash texts, mentions that there were sages who knew the secrets of the ancient generations, and how certain skills and knowledge had been transmitted through specific lineages. This fits with the idea that preserving a clan like the Anakim was not just a matter of military muscle, but of preserving access to ancient knowledge. If this is true, then the cleansing ordered by God was not only an act of holy war, but a measure to prevent that knowledge and heritage from filtering into the people of Israel. Leaving survivors was not just disobedience, it was opening the door for the forbidden to remain alive. Part 6. A pattern repeated throughout ancient history. The story of the Anakim might seem like a unique detail of Israel, but if we look beyond the pages of the Bible, we find a disturbing pattern. In many cultures, certain special lineages, often considered descendants of gods or supernatural beings, were protected, cultivated, and used, until, inevitably, they became a problem. Egypt and the divine lineage of the pharaohs. In pharaonic Egypt, the figure of the ruler was not merely political. The pharaoh was the son of Ra or the incarnation of Horus, depending on the era. The royalty claimed a hybrid origin, part human, part divine. This was not a pious metaphor, but a central element of power. The divine blood justified authority and allowed the pharaohs to present themselves as mediators between gods and men. But this very system produced dynasties that closed in on themselves, practiced consanguineous marriages, and ended up weakening their empire. Mesopotamia and the semi-divine kings in Sumer and Akkad. The royal lists record kings who reigned thousands of years before the flood and whose origins were two-thirds divine. Gilgamesh, hero of Uruk, is one such case, son of a goddess and a human king. The preservation of this lineage was seen as a guarantee of strength and wisdom, but also, according to the myths, it attracted the anger of the gods when the rulers became arrogant. Greece and the founding heroes in Greek mythology. Many cities claimed to be founded by sons of gods: Heracles, Perseus, Theseus. The divine lineage was a symbol of protection and prestige. But we also see that, in many stories, those descendants bring both glory and tragedy: wars, family curses, and the destruction of cities. When we look at these examples alongside the story of the Anakim, the pattern is clear. A special lineage arises, often associated with gods or celestial beings. That lineage is intentionally preserved for its political, military, or spiritual value. Over time, the lineage becomes a threat to the very nation that protected it. If we apply this pattern to the biblical story, the decision to keep the Anakim alive in Gaza, Gath, and Ashdod fits perfectly. The Philistines saw in them a resource and a symbol, but that choice placed them in eternal conflict with Israel, because for Israel these hybrids were not a blessing, but a corruption that needed to disappear. This leads us to a fascinating point. The Bible presents God as the only one who can and should decide which lineages remain and which must disappear. When nations, on their own, decide to preserve what God has declared forbidden, the result, sooner or later, is confrontation. Part 7. The last echo of an ancient war. When David faced Goliath in the valley of Elah, he was not simply fighting a Philistine warrior. Without knowing it, he was closing a chapter that had begun centuries earlier when Joshua left alive the last Anakim in Gaza, Gath, and Ashdod. He was, in reality, facing the echo of a war that had been fought even before the flood. The war against the hybrid lineage that began with the union of the Bene Elohim and the daughters of men. The account in 1 Samuel 17 presents Goliath with very specific details: his stature, the weight of his armor, the description of his spear. These are not mere narrative adornments. They are a visual reminder that Goliath was different, that his strength was not ordinary, and he was not alone. 2 Samuel 21 tells us that there were more giants, descendants of the same lineages, who also fell at the hands of David's men. But here is the unsettling point. Although the Bible records the death of these last known giants, it never states that the entire lineage was eradicated. And if Genesis 6 teaches us anything, it is that this kind of forbidden heritage has a strange ability to survive, to mix and to reappear at key moments in history. This leads us to a question your audience will not be able to shake off. If these hybrids managed to survive the flood, if they managed to survive Joshua, and if they even managed to survive David, is it possible that the lineage somehow remains present to this day? The Bible itself leaves doors open. In Daniel 2:43, in a prophecy about the kingdoms of the end times, it is said, "They will mingle with the seed of men, but they will not adhere to one another, just as iron does not mix with clay." Some have interpreted this as a reference to a new mixture between the human and the other in a future still to come. Thus, the story of the Anakim is not just a closed chapter in Israel's history. It is a reminder that, in the biblical narrative, there is a recurring conflict. God orders the cleansing of what corrupts his creation, but men, out of convenience, curiosity, or ambition, always find a way to preserve that which should have disappeared. And this opens the way to explore other passages that, like Joshua 11 and 14, hide enigmas and possibilities for new theories. Deuteronomy 3:11, with King Og of Bashan and his gigantic bed. Numbers 13:33, which mentions Nephilim, also afterward the flood. Psalm 82, where God judges the gods who rule the earth. Dear friends, if the story of the Anakim teaches us anything, it is that there are more mysteries in the Bible than we dare to explore. Perhaps, behind every passage that seems clear, hides the trace of a much older war, and the evidence that not everything forbidden stayed in the past. What if the giants never fully disappeared?